It is great to have everybody. My name is Claire Stern, and I'm with the Wildfire Commons. I am very pleased to introduce Kat Fong today, who's going to be talking about measuring what matters inside the Wildfire Resilience Index. And as wildfires grow more frequent, severe, and costly across North America, need for clear, data-driven tools to guide land managers and policy decisions has never been greater. The Wildfire Resilience Index launched in 2026 and is the first open access holistic tool designed to measure wildfire resilience. So Kat and the MRI team are going to be sharing the most recent findings and provide an overview of how data experts and modelers could incorporate their findings. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kat.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm really excited today to share with you all some of the work that my team and I have been doing for the last 2.5 years, developing the Wildfire Resilience Index. We actually launched the index 2 weeks ago today on May 5th. So this is a brand new tool, and we're really excited to put this in the hands of users to hear feedback. Um, to hear what's working well, what's not working well, what else you might want or need. So I'm just really excited to share some of our work with you. So if you're attending this webinar, you probably are acutely aware that wildfire is a very challenging hazard to our coupled human and natural systems. Often in social ecological systems, we call this a wicked problem. And it's a wicked problem because it is highly resistant to simple solutions, right? Wildfires lack a clear singular solution. There's often unforeseen outcomes. Managing wildfire involves behavioral changes from people, which just makes it inherently really tricky and value driven. When wildfires happen, the impacts and the responses are multifaceted and interdependent. It's a fast and dynamic system. And then managing wildfire is operationally complex. And so wildfires impact the whole of the landscape when they happen. They don't just impact particular systems, they impact all sorts of values that we hold across the landscape. And this drives a need for approaches that integrate information across multiple dimensions to create a more holistic understanding and to inform decision making. So there's a lot of existing tools in the wildfire space. And so I think it's important, at least for me, to talk a little bit about what we have and what we think the data gaps or the needs gaps are that we're filling. So odds are you've seen some map like this. This is an existing tool that we have. This is a model of wildfire risk for the United States. And it is modeling wildfire probability. So the possibility that a wildfire would occur based on, and these models incorporate wildfire, like ignition probability and then fire behavior to create these maps. We also have really good data on things like social vulnerability. So this is a map of the social vulnerability index for the United States that's hosted by, I think it's hosted by the CDC, and it incorporates and integrates information about social and economic indicators to assess what human populations are most vulnerable to hazards across the landscape. And then this is just an example of another type of map that we have. This one's not specific to wildfire, but it is reflective of some of the high effort mapping initiatives that we've had. This is a map of where imperiled species are and where we have protected areas that explicitly manage for biodiversity. So across these three different examples that I've shown, these are all things that we care about in the wildfire space. We care about what risk looks like, we care about where vulnerability is for humans, and we also care about where vulnerability is for biodiversity. And so this is the gap that we think that we fill, right? Is indexing landscape values that we care about across broad geographies at very high resolutions. That is what the Wildfire Resilience Index aims to do. It's an index that doesn't capture if there will be a fire. It captures what will the system behavior be if there's a fire, right? So it's not a probabilistic model. And I think that that really differentiates what we're doing from a lot of the other data products that are out there. And so, just some high level things to know about the index that I want to bring up front is that this is a free tool that we're providing. There's no paywall. We're not a for-profit company. We're an academic institute. It's fully open access. So everything from the data to our pipelines to our outputs are open and auditable and transparent. And this was an intentional choice that we made in developing this index. Not every wildfire tool out there is completely transparent. And for our particular tool, there's no black box. Everything you could possibly want to know is on the website. If you happen to find something that you want to know and I didn't put it on the website, then you should tell me because we are committed to being fully transparent. It's also an incredibly high effort on mapping at high resolution. So the scale at which you need to make decisions in the wildfire landscape is at the neighborhood to sub-neighborhood scale. And so all of our indicators are mapped and provided at 90-meter resolution, which is approximately the size of a football field. So it's larger than a parcel. We aren't capturing aspects of like an individual household, but we are making sure that we are capturing the spatial scale at which decisions are made. And then finally, we aren't associated with any particular government agency or even NGO, which means that we were able to do this project with wall-to-wall coverage. And what I mean by that is that for our study region, which is the Western US, British Columbia, and the Yukon Territory, we map every type of habitat, every type of watershed, like every single pixel is evaluated and scored so that we have comprehensive coverage across jurisdictions, which I think is really important because the scale at which you need to think about wildfire is not bound by management units or by geopolitical delineations. And so before I sort of show you more of what we found and what goes into this index, I really want to establish and get it firmly lodged in your head the way that we think about things and the way that we conceptualize resilience, because it shapes everything in the index. And it might be a little bit different from the way you've seen it framed before or the way that you might think about resilience yourself. So we split resilience into two complementary components: resistance, which is the capacity to withstand the negative impacts of a fire, and recovery, which is the capacity of the system to bounce back after a fire. And we keep these two elements separate throughout the entire index. And we do this not just as a conceptual distinction, um, in our aggregate, but we do this all the way down to the indicator level. So every single indicator in our index is assigned to either resistance or recovery. And the reason that we do this is because resistance and recovery capture very different approaches to building resilience. So if you have a place that scores well on recovery but poorly on resistance, what you have is a place that can rebuild after a fire, but is absorbing more damage than it needs to be in the first place. And so in that context, you're looking at a pre-fire investment problem. And if it's the other way around, you see really strong resistance but weak recovery, what you have is a place that can take the hit of the fire, but if that resistance is overwhelmed, that particular place will really struggle to recover. And so then you have a post-fire support problem. And so areas that have high resistance or low resistance, or high recovery and low recovery might have equal resilience scores as a composite, but practically, mechanistically on the ground, those require very different interventions. And so if you just collapse them into a single number, it's hard to know what you're dealing with. So across the entire index, we provide resistance and recovery as separate scores to help untangle what investments and mitigations would be most effective in different places. All right, so the Wildfire Resilience Index is something called a composite index. And so it is the average of these 8 different social ecological domains. And in developing this project, figuring out what the 8 different domains should be was a series of very long conversations with our subject matter experts, our working group, and our anticipated end users. But after months of conversation, we finally landed on these 8 domains that we think collectively capture the values that we as people have and expect from our landscape in through the lens of wildfire. So these 8 domains are infrastructure, communities, livelihoods, sense of place, species, habitats, water, and air. And so I'm going to talk briefly about each of the domains and give you a high level overview of what the domain is trying to capture and why we included it. So the first domain is infrastructure. I hope it's pretty clear why we care about infrastructure in the context of wildfire. So infrastructure in our index is about the buildings, the structures that we live, work, and interact in. We do not include water systems that belongs in the water domain. We do not include like electrical grids in our infrastructure domain. We acknowledge that they're important, but they were not elevated to domain status. And so infrastructure has a whole bunch of different indicators nested within it that relate to the ability of the people who occupy or own these structures to resist wildfire as well as recover, right? So things that minimize the probability or the risk that your structure will burn, and then afterwards, things that can help you rebuild or recover. So on the resistance side, we have things like defensible space metrics, we have state level building codes for the WUI, and we used road network data to count the number of entry or exit points out of a community to help us index the ability to get firefighting resources into an area. And these are just some examples. On the recovery side, we have other things like the wealth of the community, right? Wealthier communities are better able to rebuild. We also have a community domain, and this domain captures the shared values and the social ties of communities that share the same geographic space. So this matters because people are connected to the community that they live in, and those communities can be disrupted by wildfire. So again, we partition our indicators into resistance and recovery. On the resistance side, we have things like vehicle access because that can limit evacuation. And that's really important if you're trying to minimize fatalities. We have the presence of fire-wise communities. And the idea here is that if your community has gone through the effort to become fire-wise, that means that there's been intentional effort in the context of wildfire to strengthen those social bonds that drive cohesion. And then on the recovery side of things, we have indicators. An example is incorporation. So whether or not the community has come together and decided to have a local governance structure, we think relates to their community cohesion and capacity to recover afterwards. Livelihoods is our next domain. Livelihoods are core and central to our identity as people on the landscape, and our livelihoods can be disrupted by wildfire. So some examples of indicators in this are things like housing burden, that goes in the status side of things. So what kinds of things we expect out of our landscape. And then on the resistance and recovery side, so the resilience side of things, we have indicators like jobs that are vulnerable to wildfire, job diversity, which reflects your ability to job switch after a perturbation, and then income. Our fourth domain is species, which is very similar to biodiversity. We have this domain because people intrinsically value the biodiversity on a landscape. It is important to most people that the species that they like, grew up with, expect, continue to persist on the landscape. And so what goes into this domain is species conservation status, as well as the species traits that confer resilience. So things like age to maturity, which can, if you have a really long age to maturity, that can make recovery much more difficult. Or traits like gills or wings or how thick your bark is if you're a tree. All of those different traits get rolled up into this species resilience metric. Our next domain is habitats. These are the natural landscapes that we all value and that are at risk from wildfire. We focus predominantly on the vegetation in the habitats domain, and then the rest of the species go into the species domain. And what we're trying to estimate here, or what we're trying to index here, is how well are we preserving these landscapes for future generations? So on the status side, we have indicators like protection status. How well are we meeting our 30 by 30 goal? We also have estimated the percent of different ecoregions that have converted from natural habitat to urban development or to cropland. So what percent of the ecoregion is still ecologically intact? On the resilience side, again, we split into resistance and recovery. And we have indicators here that relate to the types of vegetation that are on the landscape and their traits. So things like bark thickness, self-pruning, serotiny, resprout, traits that confer either resistance or recovery. We have aspects that relate to like the community as a whole. So things like species diversity. And then we have our subset of environmental indicators. So things like vapor pressure deficit, rainfall, and yes, vapor pressure deficit and rainfall. This is probably the most complex domain that we have. Our next domain is called sense of place, or in science jargon, topophilia. It describes the love that you have to the place that you live. So most of us feel a pretty deep connection to the landscape. There's something about the place that we live that causes us to love it. And so this domain, sense of place, describes the cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic connections that people have to their landscapes. This domain is split into two subdomains, iconic places and iconic species. And these got elevated really because these are the places, again, that we care about. So on the iconic places side, this includes things like our national parks, our national monuments, places that have been registered in the National Historic Register. So places that we think are strongly tied to our national and our cultural identity. And then iconic species are the species that we've elevated at a state or national level to be our symbols. So the bald eagle is the national bird for the US. Every state has a bird, a flower, a tree that it's elevated to be its state symbol. And so those are the things that go into iconic species. This is also a fairly complicated domain. All right, our second to last domain is water. Um, and this is a complicated domain because it spans both social and ecological domains. So the water domain captures the availability and stability of fresh water resources. So we incorporate things like surface water timing and quantity. Are we getting enough water and is it at the right time? And then on the resilience side, how is that water transitioning from landscapes into the human domain, into our taps? So do we have, do communities have sufficient water treatment plants? Is there redundancy in the number of treatment plants so that if one goes, there's fallbacks for that community? And then we also look at the quality of those water treatment plants. So do they have good EPA compliance, or how many EPA violations have they accumulated over a calendar year? Okay, and our final domain is air. And so air is something I think we talk about a lot. At the beginning of this call, I was telling Claire that where I am in Santa Barbara, we currently have smoke in the air from the fire that's in Simi Valley right now. Air quality is important. It matters to our health, to our livelihoods, to our well-being. We want and expect clean air. And then if there is hazardous air, on the resilience side of things, we would want access to hospitals, access to medical infrastructure. So on the status side of things, we have our air quality index, so the AQI, and on the resilience side of things, we have access to hospitals and then elements of social or of demographic or personal health vulnerability. So things like asthma or the number of people who work in construction, or the number of people who are in forestry, like these jobs that are outdoors by requirement that are exposed to poor air quality. So that was a very high level overview of the 8 different domains that roll up together to create the single Wildfire Resilience Index score. I just wanted to flash up this slide briefly because the diversity of different types of data that are rolled up into this index is, I think, is pretty impressive. We have 100 some odd individual data layers that in some cases then get aggregated into indicators. Those indicators get slotted into the different status, resistance, and recovery components. Those get aggregated up into domain scores, and then the domains get further aggregated into the index score. So this was a pretty monumental data effort to identify the things that people care about on the landscape, what kinds of indicators we could get that reflect those values that were also open access, updated, and at the scale that we needed. So this has been a challenge, but I'm really hopeful that at least some of you potentially might be able to use this data product. And so just a high level visual for those of you who are a little bit more visual to think about how this data process worked. On the left-hand side, we have examples of the raw data. Those were then cleaned, processed, and fed into pipelines that are related to each of the 8 domains. Those 8 domains then get aggregated up into that composite score. It's a mean of those 8 domains. We provide the score on a scale of 0 to 100. I have a note here about anthropocentric masking, just because I get asked this question a lot. We mask all of our human-related domains, so infrastructure, communities, and livelihoods. Those are masked to human footprints, right? So where people actually live on the landscape. And the reason we did this is because a lot of these outputs are at the county level, but we have very sparsely populated counties in the American West. And so masking the human-related domains to where humans actually are, I think is more reflective of our footprint on the landscape. And then we have 4 ways that we think you all can access the data that I'm really excited to share. The first is we have a WRI website with a dashboard where you can interact directly with the data, and I'll do a demo here after I finish these slides. The next is that we have a data repository that's hosted on KNB where you can directly access every single data layer that we have. The third is that we are 99% of the way through making an R package so you can directly access the data and you can crop it to an area of interest that you might have so you don't have to deal with our huge data set. I said at the beginning that everything's at 90 meters. This means that these are just incredibly large files to work with and manipulate. And then finally, in our GitHub, we have this script that can run automatic reports. So you feed it an area of interest, and then it should spit out reports to you. And so I'm going to share results, a little bit of results. The average score across our entire study region is a 73 out of 100. And that's cool, but I think it's just the starting point for trying to understand what's happening. I think that the variation that underlies that score is where the utility of this project is. But at a very high level, looking at the map on the left, you can see that some of the lowest scores are in interior Alaska and some of our rural communities throughout the West, and that some of our highest scores are in our remote and protected natural areas. And then you also see a very strong wealth signal across this map, which surprised us at first until we started digging into it. But having access to income, to wealth, is pretty critical to being able to rebuild your communities, your infrastructure, and your livelihoods. Let's see. The other thing that the average obscures, but I think is worth elevating as a point here, is that you can have two places on the same map that have the same overall score, but intrinsically different things went into that final score. So it could be that one place has high resistance and the other place has a high recovery, or it could be that one place has really good water scores, but another place has really high infrastructure scores. And so it's worth clicking into these different places and starting to unpeel and figure out why are these different places scoring differently, and if this is the place that you live, what you want to do with it. And so I want to outline a couple of examples of what we think you can do with the index, because I think it's not just about making a snazzy tool that you can put online. It's also about thinking through what you want end users to do with this. So I'm going to highlight four examples that we think might be a good use case, but this is a place where I'm really keen to hear feedback if something sparks for you. So we think that this tool can be used for landscape treatment prioritization. And the idea here is that where resistance is low and fire hazard is high, that's a place where pre-fire investment is the most urgent. And the WRI is designed to work alongside hazard maps to help identify those places. So we don't think you should just use the WRI in isolation. We think that in combination with some of these other tools, you can identify not just where fire is most likely, but what the consequences of those fires are going to be. We think that the index can be used for post-fire resource allocation because we differentiate into resistance and recovery. You can use the tool to identify places with low recovery scores. And those are the places with the communities and the natural systems that are the least equipped to rebound on their own. And so that can help you identify the places that need technical assistance for navigating disaster programs and rebuilding support, or places where you might want to do active restoration efforts on the landscape. And the WRI, or the index, gives you a defensible and data-driven way to direct these limited resources to the communities that need them the most, and not just to the communities that are the loudest. We also think that the index is really useful for cross-boundary coordination because we use a consistent framework across every geography. You can compare in an apples to apples way across jurisdictions and land tenure in a way that you don't usually get. So our index provides a common baseline for that type of comparison, which is necessary for cross-boundary conversations, but it's not something that's readily available in a lot of tools. And then finally, we think that the tool is useful for community planning, and this is an area where we are currently seeking and starting to engage with some community members. The particular mechanism that I'm thinking about is the community wildfire protection plans. And we're not entirely sure how well this tool is going to fit with the needs of these CWPPs. The domain structure maps onto the right questions, but we are starting to test it with practitioners to see how useful the scores are for that level of planning. So if this is something you're doing or something that you're interested in, I would love to follow up with some more conversation. I also want to take a beat to highlight some of the things that we don't know yet. I think it's important to be transparent. That is part of our ethos here, and it is core to the tool. And I think it's useful to sort of highlight what some of these limitations are so that you have that in your mind before you start to engage with the tool. So the first limitation is that we have not done the work of hindcasting the WRI or testing the WRI against known fire events. So this is currently a static snapshot of 2024. And we can't tell you empirically how well these scores predict real world outcomes to fire events. That validation work is underway, but it's not done. So it's important to note that a high score is not a guarantee of safety. We are in the process of doing this validation now, but talking amongst my collaborators, we didn't want to hold back the release of this data product until we were absolutely certain it was 100% right, because it's through feedback and use that you can build a better tool. I do want to point out that the data gaps are also documented on the website. So this isn't something we're trying to sweep under the rug at all. Building codes are another example of where I think the data is a little bit weak, and we're keen to figure out if and how we can expand it in a scalable and sustainable way. So right now, the building codes are evaluated at the state level, which misses local ordinances, and local ordinances can be stricter. They can't be looser, but they can be stricter. And then the biggest domains for data gap were the water and the air domains. We did our best with the current state of knowledge, but just generally the direct quantitative relationships between things like air quality and negative health outcomes are pretty tenuous. They're modeled. Um, so we did our best with the science that we have, but there is some degree of uncertainty here, and there's definitely room for improvement. Developing this index, for me at least, really highlighted the places where we need more intensive effort to better understand wildfire impacts on our landscape. So I'm not telling you all of this to make you feel uncertain about the use. I'm telling you because I think it's important to be really honest about where these gaps are and to note that they highlight where some of the most interesting future questions are. All right, so what we would like from you, and the reason that I agreed to do this webinar is because we're really keen to start getting feedback and to hear how people are using this tool, what's working well for them, what's not working well for them, what's unclear, where we could do better. And so with that, my hope is that you all maybe have either looked at the tool or anticipate looking at the tool in the future, have looked at your place, see if it aligns with your expectation, right? Look at your home county or home census tract and see if the data is supporting how you feel. And if it's not, interrogate yourself for why, but interrogate us too for why not. And we're really keen to hear this feedback. And so before I move on to my next slide, I actually just wanted to take the risk of doing a live walkthrough of our website. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is our website, the Wildfire Resilience, I think it's called, yeah, wildfireindex.org. There's this big button in the middle that kicks you out so that you can explore the index. And so some high level things that I want to point out is we provide scores at the census tract or subdivision for Canada, counties, division for Canada, congressional districts or ridings, state or province level. And so you can click through these and pick the geography that you think is most interesting. I like census tract and divisions because I think it shows how much heterogeneity there is on the landscape. I do want to point out that for this overall resilience score, we're bounded between 65 and 85. And this is just the nature of composite indices. To get a score of 0, you would have to have a place that performed basically the worst across 8 domains. And practically, that just doesn't happen. Most places have intermediate scores, and that's a function of aggregating up across 100 different pieces of data. Over on the right-hand side, we have our overall resilience score and then our 8 different domains that you can toggle through. The domains and everything else are on a scale from 0 to 100. So I think that helps with readability a little bit. And then once you're in a domain, you can open up the domain and you can click on the different components of resilience or the different indicators that go into each of these. So you can see what varies across the landscape, where places are doing well, where they're doing poorly. There are some data gaps in here that are pretty clear to see. Um, and you can just explore what it is that you think is honestly what you think is interesting. I always give Santa Barbara as an example, probably just because that's where I live and I like it here. But if you zoom in and you click on your favorite census tract, and that's mine because I live here, I got close. Over here on the right-hand side, you get your overall index score with these petals that show how you're doing across your different, um, oh, that's weird, across your different domains. That's interesting. And so you can click wherever you want and you can get a different score, obviously, for these different regions. Um, that quirky thing that just happened, I will explain it. Not every um, domain and not every indicator is mapped in every place. And typically, this is not a data gap issue. This is an intentional decision. So, for example, I've selected habitats, and this is my count, or this is my census tract of choice for demonstrating this point. This is, it's a little town called Isla Vista right next to UC Santa Barbara. This is a high, very, very dense place where all of our students live. So it is built enough that there are not natural habitats here. It's just wall to wall building. And so there are places where you won't get scores for things like habitats because it's developed or it's all cropland. The same is true for our infrastructure scores in some geographies. I won't try to find it in Alaska because I always lose it. But there are places in Alaska, there are national parks in Alaska, for example, where nobody lives. Um, and I should caveat that there are probably indigenous people who live there, but they weren't captured in the US Census. So we are constrained in data in that way. But there are places where nobody lives according to our census records. And so then you wouldn't have infrastructure communities or livelihoods in that particular pixel. And so when individual domains drop out, instead of the score being the aggregate of 8 domains, it's the aggregate of 7 domains. I do think it's important to say that so that people don't get frustrated and think that we've broken things. Okay, so that's kind of a high level overview of the tool. My guess is that many of you on this call are fairly data savvy, and I think in a minute or two, I'm going to turn it over to Claire's team to do maybe a Python demo. But for the last 8 or 9 months, we've been working with uh, a master's capstone project here at UCSB, and they've created a R package called FireX to help access the WRI data. And I'm not going to try to do this live. I did a screen recording because I'm scared that things will break as we go. This should be done. They do their capstone graduation on Friday, so it should be done by then. And I apologize that it's blurry. Um, but basically, you can give the package shape files or JSON files or vectors. You can give it a bunch of different ways of giving it shapes. And you can query the data and you can look at the index and the catalog. And the idea here is that like we built this index on like a high performance computing server with like a lot of infrastructure, but like none of this runs, for example, on my local computer when I start trying to do some of the geospatial computations. And so if you can trim the data down and just grab the data layers that you're interested in, for example, maybe you only care about water for some reason, or you only care about air quality, you can dig in and you can extract the pieces of information that you want. And so the idea here is just to make the tool maximally useful and to make sure that we are lowering the barrier to working with this information as much as we possibly can. And so what this allows you to do is like, I didn't talk about this in too much depth, but the index is the aggregate of 8 different domains, and those domains are equally weighted. And that's because we don't have a good a priori expectation for weighting them any differently. But perhaps where you live, or what your use case is, like maybe you just don't care about sense of place. And so what this package lets you do is pull the data that you want, pull the layers that you want, and you can recalculate the index with your own weighting system, your own value system. You can substitute in better data if you want. So for example, I talked about how our building code data is at the state level. You can substitute in better data if you want. And so the framework we think is very useful, but the specific pieces of data that go into it can be flexible to whatever the needs are. And so I think they did a really great job making this um, our package. It's been really fun to start playing with. It's possible that I will be the primary user of it. So selfishly, this worked out super well for me. Um, but we're excited to get this in people's hands. And here you can see those are places where people don't live. Okay, so they have 6 different ways that you can access data. Um, you can plot it, you can manipulate it, you can do whatever you want with it. And so just to wrap that all up, um, I should probably turn it over to Claire and her team, but I just wanted to say thanks for dropping in on the webinar and hearing what I have to say. And I'm really hopeful that you go to our website, you check out the tool. If you are, are savvy, that you try out this new package that we're developing, um, and just sort of test your intuition, see if this is working the way that you expect it to. With that, I will ask Claire how I hand over control.
Thank you so much, Kat. If you want to stop sharing, and I know we've got questions in the chat, so we do want to get to those here shortly. But Pedro is going to share his screen, and what we just want to kind of share with the community is on the Wildfire Commons, you can actually take some actions with some WRI data layers that we've been able to tap into through the open source nature of this project. So what Pedro is sharing that we have on the Wildfire Commons, you can go to FireForge. It's a great way to tap into public workspaces, and these are the way to view anything that's been shared more openly. It's really a template that you can copy and add in to your own space on the Wildfire Commons. So if you do that for the WRI workspace, and I'll grab a quick link as well for the chat, so that way you guys can go from there. But once you add it to your hub, you'll be able to actually work within it. And that means launching a Jupyter notebook, which has the data layers extracted in. And what we've done as an exercise for today to share a little visual is applied a past fire map. So for example, we have the bounds of Palisades, and we've added some of the data points that WRI has collected as an example to do some exploration. So little exercise just to share, and if anybody has questions, I know Pedro and myself are always happy to answer. Um, but with that, I think we've got some burning questions for you, Kat. So I don't want to be remiss in missing any of those. I know that there was a question up front on just getting access to the data maps, and that was answered with wildfireindex.org. Mary did ask if there were any plans to add Hawaii.
Um, in my dream, I'm being recorded. I don't think anyone's gonna audit me on this one. In my dream world, we would extend to the rest of the US. Um, that would include Hawaii. It's a funding limitation, honestly, just bandwidth. Um, yeah, like Hawaii is a really good example. Parts of like the East Coast that are having some uncharacteristic fires are places where I think this would be really, really useful. The data pipelines, there's some what I call high touch data layers and then some low touch data layers. So a high touch data layer is like I read the like water policy documents for all of these states, which is like 170 different water policy documents. And building codes is like a lot of work. But some of these are very easily transportable. Like a lot of the things in the natural habitats are satellite derived, or a lot of things are from the census. So the pipelines exist. You would just have to expand the geography. I'm not going to pretend it's easy though, right? If it was easy, we would have done it. Um, but yeah, in my dream world, it would be, in my dream world, I would probably drop Canada and just extend across the US and make sure to include Hawaii. Yeah.
Caitlin, really quickly, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think I can help you with the funding. So yeah, I'm connected to the some state nonprofits that's their job. So I drop my email in there, and maybe it won't happen, but I would love to have the conversation. So I'm about as close to begging you to do this with me as I can. Thanks.
Okay. No, I would love to. I just like literally just need to hire part of an analyst's time. It's bandwidth. I see a question that are these scores static or are they changed yearly? We have some funding in hand to do annual releases for the next, I think, 2 or 3 years. So the goal is for this to be updated yearly. We don't anticipate faster than annual releases. And the reason for that is because this is not the tool that you should look at when a wildfire is happening, right? Like there are other and better platforms for that. This is really a planning tool, um, pre-fire. So it's like, where would you want to make changes or where should you have a plan to facilitate recovery? Another question, the higher score means better situation. Yes, I'm so sorry that I was not clear about that. The higher score, the higher the resilience. Another question is the aggregation weighting importance of each layer, or how is the aggregation applied? Okay, what I interpret that to be is how did we weight things? And the answer is it's complicated, and I would very much encourage you to read the deep dive on the website, um, just because it's a lot of decisions that go through, that happen here. But at a very high level, each of the 8 domains is weighted equally. Status and resilience are weighted equally, and resistance and recovery are weighted equally. So yeah, at every micro level, though, there are decisions that have to be made. Heath asked if I have a REST endpoint to stream these data into GIS software, and I don't know what that is, so I'm going to say no, we don't. If you email me with with more details, I can hand it off to my analyst and see if that's something that we can do. But we don't work with ArcGIS at all, so my knowledge of ArcGIS is like negative. There are a lot of questions. I can do this. Okay. Scott asks, is the overall resilience scored against the same fire? And this is a really good question. And this was probably the largest source of debate in our working group. So there are some systems that have, low frequency, high severity fire, and other systems that have high frequency, low severity fire. And if I mix those up, I hope you all understand what I'm trying to say. No, we did not weight against what kind of fire it would be. Beyond the fact that it's super difficult to do, it in some cases, the ecologists in the room won't like this, but in some cases it doesn't matter. In some cases it does. I do think it's a place to do a little bit more work. But we're not saying that fire is bad, right? We're trying to track the consequences. So to get a little into the weeds, because I'm assuming you're an ecologist, and so I won't use the human side of things. If you have low severity high frequency fire, like we do in our mixed conifer forests, you would expect your resistance traits like bark thickness and self-pruning and some of your recovery traits like serotiny and resprout to be fairly high. And so those systems have the capacity to absorb that kind of fire. If you have a fire that's way out of bounds, then what you'll see in the next year is poor scores when the vegetation is lost. So I'm not convinced I've done a great job of explaining it, but the answer is like it won't necessarily show up in the index because of that buffering of resistance and recovery.
Uh,
Does that make sense?
yes, it does. Kat, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. No, unfortunately, not a fire ecologist. I'm not that smart. I'm a fire manager.
Okay.
But no, I asked just because we do find, obviously, as climate change is affecting where these fires are, that community is not prepared, or even for a community that is prepared. I mean, Los Angeles is very prepared, but 2024 showed that they're not against the most catastrophic. And so that's why I ask, we had that score, but against
Yeah.
the black swan events, how well does
Yeah.
that score match up to reality?
So I'm going to say something that nobody's going to like. So I apologize in advance. But on the human side of things, Los Angeles is going to be okay. It is going to recover. Like those communities that burned, whilst incredibly tragic, have substantial wealth for recovering. They're highly incorporated. They have a lot of community organization. And you contrast that to a town like Paradise that had significantly less wealth at the time of the campfire. And like the town of Paradise is still not back at its pre-fire population level. And you're not seeing that kind of attrition in the Eaton fire or in the Palisades fire. So even though the process of or the mechanism of resilience, which is through recovery, is incredibly painful, I think it's worth noting the difference that you'll see in those places.
Th- that's hugely helpful, and I would completely agree with that sentiment because that's what we find in most rural communities in the U.S. But frankly, my previous life in on the humanitarian side internationally, same thing internationally.
Yeah. And we are like, this is a pet project that I don't have, again, don't have bandwidth to do. But like, what we're seeing is like massive attrition out of small, rural, fire-prone areas. It's not the LA. It is your like tiny town of 2 to 300 that's unincorporated with poor roads. Like, that's where you're seeing those low resistance and low recovery scores.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, Claudia, are core data sources named and available? Yes, yes, yes. Everything is named, everything is available. The scripts are there. There's a deep dive that outlines everything. If you find something missing, it's not intentional. It was just a massive amount to wrangle. Um, but yes, it's there. And yeah, if you find something missing, just tell me and I'll fix it.
Great job.
Thank you. Okay. Brett works closely with Department of Defense slash W. Oh, gotcha. Any thoughts on adding national security as a domain or subdomain? That never was brought up in any conversation I've had at this point. So I have no thoughts. I will think about it, but I have nothing intuitive to say. Sorry, I wish I did. Um, I will think
Maybe,
about it.
yeah, and maybe this could also just help because I know there's some people that are interested in interconnecting next. Kat, what would be the best way to provide feedback, questions, or opportunities that we could share here?
I'm gonna put the email in the chat. That is the best way to get a hold of me.
Great.
Okay, that was that question. Can the scores be used for susceptibility or vulnerability of a wildfire? Not strictly. This isn't about ignition. Like there's no ignition map or predictor. And it's not strictly about like vulnerability is a tough word. So I'm going to avoid it. We we have some indirect ways of thinking about the intensity of a fire or if it will be out of its characteristic range. And those are some of our climate variables. So things like if you have a drought, that will show up as lowering both your resistance and your recovery score. And that's because if you have a drought, everything's super dry, you have dry fuel. And if you have an ignition, then it's more likely that you will have a fire that's out of its characteristic range. But it's not directly modeled like that. It's not like that risk layer isn't incorporated into the index. It's an outcome um, of our thinking about resistance and recovery. Okay, I think I got through all of them. I did it. Any other questions or thoughts? This was super fun.
Yeah, a lot of great questions. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well,
Awesome.
you know how to get a hold of me if you need it. I'm like very much keen to hear feedback. This has been a labor of love, and my deepest wish is that people find it useful.